Amid a fierce blizzard on Route 80, Grace Thompson, a diner owner, was quietly counting her last $54, knowing she had only 5 days left before losing everything. Just as despair started to sink in, 12 rugged bikers knocked at her door, seeking refuge from the storm. Without hesitation, Grace welcomed them in and shared her last meal. By morning, the sound of countless motorcycles roared outside, filling the air. Before we get into this story, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below. Grace Thompson stood behind the counter at Sunset Ridge Diner, holding a handful of crumpled bills. $54. That was all she had left. The rest of her money, if you could even call it that, was wrapped in the foreclosure notice tucked beneath the cash register. The one that gave her exactly 5 days before the bank came for everything. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the small diner perched on Route 80 in the foothills of Wyoming. Snow fell thickly, transforming the world outside into an indistinct white blur. At 52, Grace had weathered many storms, but this one felt different. It felt like an end. She walked slowly around the diner, her steps echoing off the cracked tile floor. The worn red booths sat empty, their vinyl peeling from years of use. The coffee pot bubbled softly, half filled with the same bitter brew she'd made earlier in the day. It was nearing 7:30 p.m. now, and no customers had come through the door in hours. Grace stopped at booth 3, Paul's favorite seat. Even after 2 years, she still saw him there, his warm smile making the cold winters feel bearable. Grace had bought this diner with Paul 12 years ago. It had started as a dream, just the two of them, a little inheritance from her grandmother, and the hope of creating a place where weary travelers could find a warm meal and a kind word. "We're going to make it work," Paul had said, always the optimist. Now, the lights above her flickered, and the heating system struggled against the biting cold. Grace wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and walked back to the counter where the notice from the bank mocked her. The CB radio crackled faintly in the corner of the diner, its antenna bent from years of neglect. Once, it had been the lifeline to truckers passing through, their voices offering road reports and the occasional joke. Now, it mostly sat silent, like the rest of the diner, a relic of a time when things had been better. Grace opened the register one last time, counting the money, hoping for some miracle. But the $54 wouldn't even cover the electric bill, let alone the mortgage payments due. She had already sold everything she could, Paul's tools, her engagement ring, anything of value, yet it hadn't been enough. This diner was all that remained. The wind outside picked up, slamming against the walls of the diner. The neon sign flickered, threatening to go out completely. Looking out the window, Grace could see the snow piling high against the gas pumps, burying them beneath thick, white drifts. The highway was invisible now, completely covered by the storm. Glancing at the clock above the coffee machine, she saw it was 8 p.m. It was time to close. Time to flip the sign to closed, pack up, and face the inevitable. Tomorrow, she'd call the lawyer, maybe see if there was some payment plan that could save her. But in her heart, she knew it was hopeless. The bank had already been more than patient. As she reached for the light switch, she heard it. A low rumble that cut through the howling wind, much deeper than the sound of a snowplow. At first, Grace thought it was just the storm, but the noise grew louder, rhythmic, and steady. She pressed her face against the cold window, squinting through the snow. There was nothing at first, just the blinding white. Then, as if from nowhere, she saw them, headlights cutting through the storm. Beneath those lights were motorcycles. A lot of them. The rumble grew louder, and Grace counted 12 motorcycles in total, each one roaring through the snowstorm in tight formation. They pulled into the diner's lot, headlights sweeping across the windows, filling the empty dining room with harsh light. Grace stepped back from the window, her heart pounding. She had heard of motorcycle gangs, but she had never seen one up close. These men looked like something out of a movie. Leather jackets, boots, and helmets that hid their faces. The leader of the pack dismounted first, a tall, broad-shouldered man who seemed to command the others without a word. He looked toward the diner, and Grace felt the weight of his gaze even from behind the glass. Slowly, deliberately, he began walking toward the door. Grace's hand hovered over the light switch. She could turn off the lights, lock the door, pretend the diner was closed. These men wouldn't know the difference. They'd probably move on and find somewhere else to wait out the storm. But as the man got closer, Grace noticed something that stopped her cold. He was limping. Not badly, but enough for her to notice. The others behind him were dismounting as well, and she could see that several of them were struggling. They had been riding in this storm for hours, and they were cold, exhausted, and desperate for shelter. The man reached the door and paused, his gloved hand hovering over the handle. Through the glass, Grace could now see his face clearly. He was older than she had expected, maybe in his mid-40s, with streaks of gray in his beard. His eyes were tired, worn from years on the road. They were the eyes of someone who had endured hardships and recognized them in others. He knocked 3 times, gentle but firm, respectful yet urgent. Grace looked at the $54 on the counter, the foreclosure notice, then back at the man waiting in the storm. Paul's voice echoed in her mind. A place for travelers. A home away from home. She walked to the door and turned the lock. As Grace opened the door, the full force of the storm hit her, icy winds and snow swirling inside, instantly dropping the temperature. The man standing at the threshold was covered in ice and snow. His leather jacket was frozen stiff, and his beard was white with frost. But it wasn't just him. Behind him, Grace saw the others dismounting from their bikes. These weren't ordinary bikers. The jackets bore a logo she recognized, the unmistakable Death's Head insignia, the skull with wings, the words Hell's Angels boldly emblazoned. There were 12 of them, each massive, with arms like tree trunks and faces hardened by years of rough living. The leader was easily 6 feet 3 inches, with salt and pepper hair pulled into a tight ponytail and a gray beard that reached his chest. His arms were covered in tattoos, intricate designs Grace could only guess the meaning of. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jawline, and his eyes were a pale, piercing blue. They held the weight of someone who had seen too much. Behind him, the others looked like characters from a gritty film about outlaw bikers. One had a tattoo of a spiderweb on his neck, another sported a mohawk despite being well into his 50s, and the youngest member couldn't have been more than 23. The leader looked at her, his eyes sharp and steady. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from the cold. "I know this is a lot to ask, but we've been on the road for hours. The highways are shut down, and we won't make it much further. Can we come in and warm up?" Grace's heart raced. Everything in her screamed to close the door, lock it, and call the authorities. These men looked like they could tear apart her diner with their bare hands. But there was something in the leader's eyes. Exhaustion, yes, but also something else. Hope. "How many of you are there?" Grace asked, her voice trembling as she already knew the answer. 12, the leader replied. "I'm Jack Freeman. We're from the Iron Ridge chapter, heading back from a memorial service down south. We've got cash for food and coffee. We just need somewhere warm to wait out the storm." As Grace brewed the coffee, she noticed the bikers settling into their seats, taking up space in the small diner with ease. The older men chose the booths, while the younger ones sat near the counter. Their leather jackets creaked with every movement, the patches catching the dim light overhead. Grace caught a glimpse of their tattoos, intricate designs that told stories she could only guess at. There was something about them, something familiar, despite their intimidating exterior. She noticed how the senior members seemed to direct the flow of things, ensuring that the younger ones were taken care of without a word being spoken. The youngest one, still trembling from the cold, sat near the window, his eyes scanning the diner as though trying to make sense of where he was. Grace caught a flicker of something in his gaze, fear, maybe? Or exhaustion, the kind that came from days on the road, fighting the weather. He was a kid, no more than 22, but his eyes held a depth that didn't belong to someone his age. A few of the men quietly adjusted their jackets, making sure they didn't crowd him. Grace wondered about the stories they carried, stories that had brought them here, to this lonely diner on the edge of the highway. Jack, the leader, pulled a stool up to the counter and gave Grace a nod of thanks as she placed a hot mug in front of him. "Haven't seen a storm like this in years," he said, his gravelly voice filling the space between them. "We've been stuck on the road for over 12 hours, and now it's shut down completely. No word on when the road will reopen." Grace nodded quietly, pouring herself a cup of coffee as she watched him. His jacket was open now, revealing patches that spoke of leadership and military service. An American flag pin caught her eye, and she wondered if the stories of these men were more complicated than she had first assumed. They weren't just bikers. They were soldiers, travelers, survivors. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling through the cracks in the diner's walls. Grace glanced at the window, noticing the snow piling up against the edges. The road wasn't going to clear anytime soon, and there was no telling how long these men would be stranded. Her mind raced with calculations. 15 men, no food left in the kitchen, and barely $54 in her register. She was running out of options fast. "Grace," Jack said, breaking her train of thought. "I know this isn't the best time, but we need to talk about payment for all this." Her heart sank, and she almost choked on the coffee she'd just taken a sip of. "Don't worry about it," she interrupted, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "I'm just doing what I can. It's not about payment." But Jack didn't let it go. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers. "It's more than just food. It's hospitality. You've already given us more than we deserve." His tone softened. "But I can't leave here without making sure you're taken care of too. How long do you have?" Grace didn't hesitate. 5 days, she said quietly. 5 days until the bank takes everything." There was a long pause as Jack looked her over, his gaze unwavering. She expected sympathy, or maybe some words of comfort. But instead, he said, "That's not happening. Not on our watch." Grace frowned, unsure what he meant by that. She had already made peace with the idea of losing the diner. It was inevitable, wasn't it? But Jack's expression was serious. "You've opened your doors to us when you didn't have to. You've shown us kindness when most people would have turned us away. We're going to make sure you don't lose this place." The words hung in the air between them. For a moment, Grace didn't know what to say. "How?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop it. "How can you help me? You've already done more than enough." Jack sat back, his eyes narrowing as he seemed to consider her question. "There's more than one way to solve a problem," he said slowly. "And in this case, I think we've got the right connections. You don't know it, but you've helped more people than you can imagine. You've saved lives, Grace. And it's time we return the favor." Before Grace could ask what he meant, she heard a soft voice from the back booth. "You don't know how right he is." One of the older bikers, Pete, spoke up. His voice was gruff, but there was a warmth to it. "This diner has been a beacon to more people than you think. I remember when I was stuck here, years ago, just like the rest of us. You fed me when I had nothing to offer. You gave me hope when I didn't have any left." Grace felt a pang in her chest as Pete's words hit home. She hadn't realized the impact she'd had on these men. She had simply done what felt right at the time. Fed them, listened to their stories, offered a warm meal and a place to rest. But to them, it had meant more than she could ever understand. "It's not just about food," Pete continued. "It's about what you do for people when they're at their lowest. You make them feel like they matter, like they're not invisible." Another biker, Marcus, nodded. "I remember the time I broke down here in the snow. You helped me fix my bike, no questions asked. You didn't take any money. Just a hot cup of coffee and some company." Grace's throat tightened. She hadn't realized how many of these men had passed through her diner over the years. She had simply done what Paul would have wanted. She had tried to be kind, to help when people needed it most. Danny, the youngest biker, looked up at her from his seat by the window. "You helped me too," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was here a few years ago, lost and confused. You gave me a meal when I didn't know where I was going. And you didn't judge me." Grace blinked, the weight of his words settling over her. "I remember you," she said softly, her voice cracking. "You were struggling." "Yeah," Danny nodded, his eyes dark with the memory. "But you made me feel like it was okay. You made me believe that there was still good in the world, that I wasn't alone." The room fell quiet, the only sound the crackling of the radio and the steady hum of the coffee machine. Grace stared at the men around her, all of them so different from the rough image she had imagined. They weren't just bikers. They were people who had found something in this diner, in her kindness, that had made a difference in their lives. Jack leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "You've been a light for people when they needed it most, Grace. Now it's time for us to be that light for you." A lump formed in Grace's throat as she realized what he was offering. These men, the Hells Angels, were about to change her life in a way she couldn't have imagined. But they weren't just helping her because she had helped them. They were helping her because they understood the importance of kindness, of offering something to others when you had nothing left to give. "I don't know what to say," Grace whispered, overwhelmed by their words. "You don't have to say anything," Jack said with a reassuring smile. "Just know that this place, and you, aren't alone anymore." As the storm raged outside, Grace realized that something bigger than the diner was unfolding before her eyes. The light she had kept burning for years was about to be returned in ways she couldn't have predicted. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt the stirrings of hope. The storm didn't let up, but in the warmth of the diner, things began to shift. The bikers settled in for the night, sipping coffee, talking in low voices, and playing cards. Grace refilled mugs, her mind buzzing with the gravity of the night. She watched them, trying to absorb everything. These men, tough and weathered, had come in from the storm, but their faces were not just hardened by years on the road. They were softened by gratitude. As the hours ticked by, more of them dozed off in booths or slumped against the counter, the exhaustion of their long ride catching up with them. Grace moved around the diner, tidying up the counter and refilling coffee mugs, feeling oddly at ease in the midst of this unexpected company. There was a comfort in the chaos, in knowing that, for now, she wasn't alone. The clock inched toward midnight, and Grace found herself at the counter, her mind still racing with possibilities. She glanced at the window, where the snow continued to fall. Outside, the parking lot was already filled with bikes, their chrome and leather silhouettes barely visible beneath the thick snow. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this uncertain, yet oddly hopeful. Jake had made a few phone calls earlier, disappearing into the storm for nearly an hour. When he returned, he'd said nothing, only pouring himself another cup of coffee and settling into his chair. The others hadn't said much either, but there was a tension in the air now, as if something was waiting to happen. By 1 a.m., the diner was quiet, the hum of conversation replaced by the soft sound of snoring from one of the larger bikers in a booth near the window. The storm outside had worsened, the wind howling louder than before. Grace found herself standing at the counter, her hand resting on the coffee machine as she tried to focus on the tasks ahead. That's when the door opened again. This time, it wasn't the sound of motorcycles that heralded the arrival. It was the sharp crack of a heavy gust of wind followed by a wave of snow blowing in. Grace blinked in surprise as she saw more headlights cutting through the snow. It wasn't just a few bikes now. There were a lot more. One by one, they rolled into the diner's parking lot, headlights sweeping across the snow-covered ground. Grace's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the logo on the jackets. Hell's Angels. More of them. A lot more. This time, they weren't alone. Block 8. The first few bikes pulled into the lot, their engines growling as the riders dismounted and began walking toward the diner. As they got closer, Grace realized these weren't just bikers from Jack's chapter. The patches were different: Denver, Phoenix, Salt Lake City. Hell's Angels from all over the West were converging on her diner. "Jake," Grace whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "What's going on?" Jake looked up from his coffee, a knowing smile on his face. "I told you, Grace," he said softly. "You're not alone anymore." Within minutes, the parking lot was full. Bikers from different chapters, all wearing their Hell's Angels patches with pride, filed into the diner one by one. Some were carrying large duffel bags, others were pulling in extra gear. Their leather jackets creaked and groaned with every movement, and the air in the diner seemed to shift with the growing presence of so many men. The last man to enter was a large, imposing figure. He was broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and tattoos running down both arms. He looked like he had seen it all. As he walked toward the counter, Grace instinctively stepped back. But he smiled at her warmly, not at all like the intimidating figure she had imagined. "You must be Grace," the man said, his voice deep and calm. I am," she said, a little shaken. "I'm Mike Hendress," he said, extending his hand. "I'm with the Oakland chapter. I owe you my life." Grace blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." Mike chuckled, his smile broadening. "About 15 years ago, I broke down right outside this diner. You helped me, called an ambulance, stayed with me all night. You saved me, Grace." The memory hit her hard. She had forgotten that night, but now it came rushing back, an injured man on the side of the road, freezing in the snow. She had helped him. She had always tried to help people, but she never expected it to come back like this. "You saved my life," Mike repeated. "And now, we're here to return the favor." Before Grace could respond, another biker spoke up from the back. "I remember you, Grace. You helped my son when he was in a car wreck. You fed him and sent him on his way." "Me too," another voice chimed in. "My bike broke down years ago. You let me sleep here while I waited for a part. I'll never forget that. The voices kept coming, each one telling stories of how Grace had helped them during some of the darkest times in their lives. The diner was filling up with men who had once been strangers, but who now shared a bond with her that she couldn't fully comprehend. Jack stood up and made his way to the front of the diner, his voice cutting through the growing buzz of conversation. All right, everyone, let's get this done. He pulled out an envelope from his jacket and placed it on the counter in front of Grace. The diner fell silent. Block 9. Grace stared at the envelope, unsure what to expect. Her heart raced as she reached for it. Inside was a large sum of cash, more than she had ever seen in her life. $45,000, Jack said. Cash. From all the chapters. It's enough to clear your debt. Enough to keep this place running. Grace's hands trembled as she held the money. It didn't seem real. This is too much, she stammered. I can't accept this. You don't have a choice, Mike said with a grin. You've done enough for all of us. Now it's our turn. The room erupted into cheers and applause. Grace could hardly believe it. Her diner, her dream, wasn't going anywhere. The Hells Angels had come together to save it. But it wasn't just about the money. It was the recognition of everything she had done for others without ever expecting anything in return. These men, who had once been strangers, now saw her for what she truly was, someone who had given them more than just a meal or a warm place to stay. She had given them hope, a reason to keep going. Grace felt her eyes welling up with tears. She had given so much of herself over the years, but now, it was coming back to her in ways she had never imagined. These men weren't just bikers. They were her family now. We've got your back, Jack said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. This diner, your dream, it's not just yours anymore. It's ours. You've been a light for so many people, Grace. We're going to make sure it stays that way. And just like that, Midnight Haven Diner became something more than a diner. It became a sanctuary, a place where people came to find comfort, no matter who they were or where they came from. And with the Hells Angels behind her, Grace knew that no storm, no hardship, could ever take it away again. Block 10. In the months that followed, Sunset Ridge Diner was transformed. With the money from the Hells Angels, Grace was able to pay off the debts, repair the building, and make the diner a true haven for travelers. The bikers, true to their word, came through in ways that surprised even her. They helped renovate the diner, adding a proper lounge for bikers, secure parking, and a maintenance area. They made sure the diner would be a place for riders, truckers, and anyone passing through the area. And, just as Jack had promised, it became a safe haven for all. But it wasn't just about the upgrades. Grace found herself surrounded by a community of people who respected her, who valued the kindness she had always given. They came from all over the country: Oakland, Phoenix, Denver, Salt Lake City. Hell, even from far beyond. They came for the food, yes, but mostly, they came for the warmth. One snowy evening, a few months later, Grace stood behind the counter, watching the motorcycles parked outside. It was a busy night, and the diner was full of bikers sharing stories, laughing, and catching up with one another. As she poured coffee into a mug, she glanced up and saw Jake walking toward her, a slight smile on his face. "You did it," he said softly, his eyes glinting with pride. Grace shook her head in disbelief. "We did it. Together." And as the storm continued to howl outside, Grace knew that she had found something more than just a place to serve food. She had found her purpose, and it was bigger than she ever imagined.